If I asked you who won the race to the moon, you'd probably say America. And if I asked when that race ended, you'd probably say more than 50 years ago. That's exactly what I believe too. Then I noticed something I couldn't explain. Governments that rarely agree on anything quietly began returning to the moon. New lunar missions multiplied. Private companies joined in. Rival nations invested billions. Yet almost nobody talked as if a new race had begun. That contradiction stayed with me. If the race to the moon was really over, why were so many of the world's most powerful organizations suddenly acting as if it had started again? I couldn't answer that question, so I started following the pattern. For more than half a century, that assumption never seemed worth questioning. Apollo ended. The astronauts came home, and the moon slowly faded into the background. If anyone mentioned it at all, it was usually as one of history's greatest achievements, not the beginning of something unfinished. That was the version of the story I accepted too. Then the pattern started to appear. NASA wasn't preparing for one ceremonial return. It was building Artemis as a program designed to return again and again, with the expectation that people would keep going back instead of closing the book once more. I could have dismissed that as one country's ambition, except the same thing was happening somewhere else. Commercial companies weren't treating the moon as an impossible government project anymore. They were designing lunar landers, winning contracts, and preparing for repeated missions as if regular access to the moon was becoming a realistic business rather than a distant dream. The more I looked, the harder it became to believe this was nostalgia. One announcement became another. One mission was followed by another. Instead of slowing down, lunar exploration seemed to be gaining momentum. That completely changed how I looked at the moon. Maybe the story hadn't ended after Apollo. Maybe we'd simply stopped paying attention while a new chapter quietly began. And if two very different groups had reached the same conclusion independently, then the obvious question wasn't whether we were returning. It was why so many different people suddenly believed the moon was worth returning to at all. At first, I expected all of this to trace back to one breakthrough. Usually that's how technological races work. Someone moves first, everyone else reacts. But the more timelines I compared, the less that explanation survived. The United States was moving forward with Artemis. China was expanding its own long-term lunar program. India continued building on the success of Chandrayaan. Japan and Europe were committing new missions and partnerships. None of them were waiting for permission from anyone else. That was the part I couldn't ignore. These governments compete with each other in technology, economics, and geopolitics. They rarely agree on the future. Yet somehow they were all investing in the same destination. It didn't look coordinated. It looked independent. Different strategies, different political systems, different priorities, but they were all arriving at the same conclusion. The moon mattered again. The more mission announcements I compared, the stranger the pattern became. Each program had its own timeline, its own hardware, its own objectives, but they all pointed toward the same place. That made imitation feel like an incomplete answer. Countries can copy technology. They don't usually copy long-term national priorities at the same time. Something larger had changed. Something important enough that rival nations, working separately, had all decided the moon deserved another generation of investment. And once I realized that, the question became impossible to avoid. If they had all reached the same destination independently, what had they seen that the rest of us hadn't? At that point, I expected the competition to spread across the entire moon. After all, if returning was the goal, almost any landing site should have worked. The moon is enormous. From Earth, it looks like one endless landscape of craters, mountains, and plains. Why would one location matter more than another? Then I started comparing the mission plans. Again and again, the same destination appeared. Not the equator. Not the places made famous during Apollo. The lunar South Pole. At first, I assumed it was coincidence. One mission, choosing the South Pole, meant very little. But every time I opened another mission plan, the same destination appeared again. Different agencies, different spacecraft, different countries, Yet they all kept converging on the same small region. That's when coincidence stopped feeling like an explanation. Governments don't build decade-long exploration programs around coincidence. There had to be something there that was valuable enough to reshape plans across the entire world. And once I realized that, I stopped asking why the moon mattered. I started asking why one small corner of it mattered so much more than the rest. The more I followed those plans, the more another assumption quietly fell apart. I had been thinking the goal was another landing. Touch the surface. Plant a flag. Collect samples. Come home. That was the Apollo model. But modern mission architectures were describing something completely different. Instead of one mission, they showed a continuous presence. Instead of a single spacecraft, they included habitats, logistics, communications, transportation, and an orbiting station designed to support repeated operations around the moon. I remember staring at one of those architecture diagrams longer than I expected. It wasn't filled with one spacecraft heading to the surface. It showed habitats, cargo routes, communications, power systems, vehicles supporting other vehicles. For a moment, I forgot I was looking at a lunar program. It looked like the blueprint for a place people expected to keep using. That realization changed the entire story. The landing was no longer the destination. It was only the beginning. The same pattern appeared outside government programs. Commercial lunar payload services wasn't organized around one historic landing. It treated repeated cargo deliveries as the normal expectation. That was the clue I had been missing. You don't build a supply chain for somewhere you only intend to visit once. And that raised an even bigger question. If remaining on the moon had become more valuable than simply reaching it, what had changed enough to make permanence worth pursuing? That question stayed with me because it forced me to rethink what the moon actually was. For decades, we treated it like a destination. A place you reached. A place you explored. Then you left. But the people designing the next generation of missions weren't talking that way anymore. Again and again, they described the moon as the first step towards somewhere else. NASA summarized the strategy in 4 simple words. Moon to Mars. At first, it sounded like a slogan, but the longer I followed mission planning, the more those words changed meaning. Mars wasn't replacing the moon. The moon was becoming the step that made Mars possible. That explained why so much attention was suddenly focused on infrastructure instead of individual missions. The Lunar Gateway wasn't imagined as another historic landmark. It was designed as a logistics platform where spacecraft, crews, and supplies could move through cislunar space as part of a much larger system. That was the moment everything shifted for me. The moon wasn't becoming important because people wanted to stand on it again. It was becoming important because it could support everything that came after it. In other words, the moon had quietly stopped being the destination. It was becoming the highway. And once I saw it that way, another question immediately followed. If building that highway was now a strategic priority, what made governments willing to invest so heavily in it? For a long time, I assumed this was still mostly about science. That seemed like the obvious explanation. Space agencies had always talked about exploration, research, and discovery. So I expected those same priorities to be driving this new return. What surprised me wasn't just what governments were planning, it was the language they kept using. I expected to see words like exploration and discovery. Instead, I kept finding capability, infrastructure, partnerships, long-term access. Those aren't the words countries usually choose when they're talking about a temporary expedition. The pattern became even clearer as new partnerships began to form. The Artemis Accords brought together a growing group of nations around a shared framework for future lunar exploration. While other countries pursued their own alliances and long-term plans, no one owned the moon. The Outer Space Treaty still prohibited national sovereignty over it. But countries were clearly positioning themselves for a future in which sustained activity around the moon could become increasingly important. That completely changed how I looked at the competition. Science was still there. It mattered, but it no longer looked like the entire story. The moon was becoming part of something much larger than scientific discovery alone. And if governments were investing this heavily for reasons that reached beyond research, then one final question remained. What exactly had they found that could make the moon strategically valuable in the first place? Eventually, almost every investigation led back to the same word: water. Not oceans, not flowing rivers, just ancient ice locked inside permanently shadowed craters near the lunar South Pole. At first, I honestly didn't understand why scientists kept returning to it. Water sounded important. It didn't sound world-changing. Then I looked at the problem from a spacecraft's perspective. Every drop of water, every kilogram of oxygen, every kilogram of fuel normally has to climb out of Earth's gravity. Suddenly, the discovery wasn't just about finding ice. It was about finding a place where future missions might stop carrying absolutely everything with them. That possibility explains why agencies have become increasingly interested in technologies known as in situ resource utilization, or ISRU. The idea is surprisingly simple. Use local resources instead of bringing everything from Earth. None of this has been proven at operational scale. No permanent lunar industry exists today. The amount of economically recoverable ice is still uncertain. But for the first time, the question was no longer whether the moon had resources. It was whether those resources could transform how humanity operates in space. And if they could, then an even larger future suddenly became possible. By then, I thought I understood the story. The moon had resources. That explained why everyone was going back. But it still didn't explain why so many different plans looked strangely connected. Then I stopped comparing missions. I started comparing everything around the missions. The transportation plans, the communication systems, the logistics, the timeline. That's when something unexpected happened. Separate projects began fitting together like pieces from the same picture. The moon wasn't sitting beside humanity's future plans. It was sitting in the middle of them. Again and again, exploration roadmaps placed sustained lunar operations before deeper missions into the solar system. The sequence kept repeating. Build transportation, establish communications, develop logistics, learn how to operate continuously, then go farther. None of those pieces made much sense as isolated projects. Together, they formed a single system. That was the realization I had been missing. The moon wasn't one destination competing with Mars or anything beyond it. It was the place where many of those futures began to connect. Transportation depended on it. Logistics depended on it. Long-term human operations depended on it. The more I looked, the less these appeared to be separate programs. They looked like different parts of the same blueprint, even when they were created by different organizations, and that answered one question while creating another. The global return to the moon was never driven by one mission. It was driven by the realization that an entire space architecture could be built around, which left only one final question. If that architecture succeeds, what does it mean for the future we are about to enter? Looking back, one thing kept bothering me. Nothing I had found resembled the second Apollo. The missions were different. The goals were different. Even the way governments talked about the moon had changed. That's when I realized the biggest mistake wasn't thinking the moon race had ended. It was assuming the next one would look like the first. The same pattern appeared everywhere I looked. Scientific research, industrial planning, transportation systems, international partnerships, even geopolitical competition. They weren't moving toward the moon for exactly the same reason, but they were all moving toward the same conclusion. The moon had become a foundation instead of a finish line. That doesn't mean every plan will succeed. No permanent human base exists there today. The true amount of usable lunar water remains uncertain. Many of the technologies needed for long-term industry are still experimental, and the future economic value of the moon has not yet been proven. But those uncertainties no longer change the larger picture. The return was never driven by nostalgia. It was driven by the belief that the next era of exploration, industry, and human expansion may depend on what we build there first. When this investigation began, I thought I was looking back at history. By the end, it felt like I was looking at the early chapters of something that hasn't happened yet. The growing number of missions, rival nations reaching the same conclusion. The focus on the South Pole, infrastructure instead of flags, water instead of trophies. None of those discoveries existed to recreate Apollo. Together, they pointed toward a future where the moon is no longer remembered as humanity's greatest destination. It may become the place that makes every future destination possible. Which means the biggest surprise wasn't that the world returned to the moon. It was realizing the story we thought had ended may only have been the prologue.